The city of Detroit was soaked in cold rain, the kind that seeped through every layer of clothing and clung to the skin like a second, colder self. Night had fallen hard, and the streets buzzed with the chaos of buses, neon lights, and the distant hum of traffic rolling over cracked asphalt. Calavere stood at the corner of a closed diner, her thin jacket plastered to her shoulders, her sneakers soaked through. She clutched a paper bag with what remained of her dinner, half a bruised banana and a day-old granola bar. Her shift at the laundromat had ended hours ago, and she had just come from her second rejection of the day. Another restaurant, another, "We're not hiring right now," with eyes that didn't bother hiding their judgment. She had learned not to expect kindness in voices, especially from people who lived above the third floor of any building. At 19, Calla had seen more than some saw in a lifetime. Her mother had died in a fire when Calla was 12, the kind of blaze that left no room for rescue, only smoke and screams. Afterward, she was placed under the care of her mother's half-brother, a man whose favorite words were shouted and whose favorite drink was whatever was cheapest and hardest. She had fled that house at 17 and never looked back. Since then, she had worked jobs that broke her back and stiffened her hands. Cleaning, washing, lifting, surviving. She lived in a one-room flat where the heat rattled more than it worked, and the walls were so thin she could hear every argument of the neighbors next door. But she had her own key, and that meant something. That night, the cold hit deeper than usual. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the silence. Her phone had died hours ago, and she didn't have enough change for a bus fare. She debated walking the 12 blocks home, but her feet ached and her socks were squishing with every step. She sank onto the edge of the sidewalk under the glow of a flickering streetlight and pulled her knees to her chest. As she chewed the granola bar slowly, trying to stretch the taste, her eyes wandered. A black car pulled up across the street, not the kind of car anyone in her neighborhood drove. This one was sleek, polished, the kind of car that looked like it had never known a scratch. The door opened, and a tall man stepped out, holding a phone to his ear and barking something she couldn't make out over the rain. He was dressed in a black wool coat, the cut expensive and sharp, like he walked straight out of a magazine. His voice was crisp and commanding, not yelling exactly, but the kind of voice that made other people shut up and listen. He moved with purpose, like he belonged wherever he went. Something fell from his hand as he stepped onto the curb. A folder, thick with papers, clapped shut but already dampening in the rain. Without thinking, Calla pushed herself up and hurried across the street. Her fingers were numb, but she reached down, grabbed the folder, and caught up to the man just before he reached the entrance of a building with mirrored doors. "Hey, excuse me, you dropped this," she said, holding out the folder. He turned slowly. His face was sharply defined, cheekbones high, jaw clenched. His eyes, pale gray like the edge of a storm, landed on her. For a moment, they both just stood there, the rain drumming on the sidewalk between them. He took the folder from her hand without speaking, but he didn't walk away either. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in thought. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low and measured. Calla blinked, taken aback. "Calla," she said. "Vere." He nodded once, almost absently. "Thank you." And then he walked inside without another word. Calla stood there for a moment longer, feeling oddly seen and just as quickly discarded. The door closed behind him, the mirrored glass reflecting only the rain and the faint outline of her figure. She exhaled and turned away, hugging herself as she began the long walk home. 3 days later, she received a letter. Not a call, not a message. An actual envelope slid beneath her door, sealed and embossed with initials she didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a job offer, live-in domestic help, temporary position, high compensation, confidential, a contact number. She stared at it for hours, debating whether it was a joke. But curiosity outlived caution, and when she called the number the next morning, a professional voice confirmed the position was still available and that she had already been pre-selected for an interview, if she was still interested. 2 days after that, she stood at the gates of a sprawling estate on the edge of Lake Michigan, miles away from the familiar decay of her city block. The house wasn't a house at all. It was a mansion in the truest sense of the word, with towering windows, manicured gardens, and a wrought iron fence that whispered of wealth old enough to not need to prove itself. She wore her best clothes, a plain blouse and dark jeans that didn't have any holes, and carried a small duffel bag because the letter had mentioned she'd be staying on site if hired. Her breath fogged in the cold morning air as the gates opened silently, and a driver in a uniform gestured for her to follow. Inside, the mansion was so silent it almost hurt her ears. The marble floors gleamed beneath chandeliers and oil paintings lined the hallways. She was taken to a drawing room where a woman in a tailored suit introduced herself as the house manager. She spoke briefly, efficiently, with phrases like non-disclosure agreement, routine responsibilities, and discretion expected. Then, without preamble, she said, "Mr. Maddox will see you now." Calla didn't recognize the name until the door opened. There he was, the man from the street, the one with the sharp voice and expensive coat. He was seated behind a grand desk in a study that looked more like a library. He didn't stand when she entered, but his eyes flicked up from the screen in front of him and locked onto hers. "You," she breathed. "You remembered," he said calmly. "I returned a folder." "You returned more than that," he replied, folding his hands together. "You returned humanity. Most people would have taken it and walked away." Calla didn't know what to say to that. "I need someone here, temporarily. Someone discreet. My son hasn't spoken since his mother died, and for reasons I don't fully understand, he noticed you. You don't need experience. You just need to be present." Calla frowned. "Why me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you weren't supposed to matter, but you did." That was the day her life changed. And it wouldn't be the last time this man would alter the course of her world with a single decision. The morning after her unexpected arrival at the Maddox estate felt almost surreal to Calla. The room she had been given was larger than her entire apartment back in Detroit. It had pale cream walls, high ceilings trimmed with ornate molding, and an antique chandelier that glittered quietly even without the lights on. The bed was so soft it had swallowed her the night before, and for the first time in years she had slept without waking in the middle of the night to sirens, shouting neighbors, or the sound of her own thoughts keeping her restless. But now that she was awake and the reality of where she was had settled in, everything felt sharper. It wasn't a dream. She had really been hired. By him, Thayer Maddox. A billionaire whose name she'd only seen in headlines and business magazines left behind on subway seats. And now she was working in his home. She sat on the edge of the bed, braiding her damp hair quickly after showering, and tried to calm the unease churning in her stomach. She wasn't sure exactly what her duties would be, only that she was expected to assist with light domestic tasks and spend time with his son Wyatt. That part made her nervous. She had never been around children, certainly not ones grieving the loss of a parent. What did she even say to a child like that? What did she say to a man like Thayer Maddox? When she emerged from the room, the hallway outside was silent. Every inch of the house seemed to echo with absence. No clinking dishes, no murmuring voices, no distant footsteps. It was a mansion with the life drained out of it. Cold, beautiful, controlled. She made her way downstairs where Mrs. Alden, the house manager, was already waiting. The older woman was tall, severe-looking, but not unkind. She gestured for Calla to follow her down a polished hallway that opened into the main kitchen. The place was immaculate, too perfect, like a model home. It smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and nothing else. Not butter, not coffee, not toast. Nothing human. "You'll be responsible for Wyatt's afternoon routine. Supervised play, light tutoring, and meals if he requests anything special," Mrs. Alden explained. "He has not spoken since the loss of his mother. That was almost a year ago now. He is sensitive, withdrawn." Calla nodded. "Does he like company?" Mrs. Alden hesitated, folding her hands. "He tolerates it. But yesterday, he asked to see the girl from the street." Calla blinked. "Me?" "Yes," Mrs. Alden replied. "We don't question such things here. If Mr. Maddox believes you might bring comfort to his son, then you will do exactly that. Do I meet him now?" Mrs. Alden nodded and led her to a room at the rear of the house, a sunroom enclosed in glass with soft light streaming in from all sides. A boy sat at a child-sized table in the corner, quietly coloring with a set of pencils arranged in perfect lines. He had dark hair like his father and pale skin. His small shoulders hunched as though he had learned to take up less space than he was given. Calla stepped closer, her footsteps careful. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she crouched down beside the table and gently picked up one of the colored pencils. "You like to draw?" she asked, keeping her voice low. The boy didn't look at her. His pencil moved steadily across the paper, sketching the outline of a tree. He didn't nod. He didn't answer. But he didn't move away either. "I used to draw when I was little," she continued softly. "Mostly faces. My mom's mostly. I didn't want to forget her face after she was gone." That made him pause, just for a second. Then he continued coloring, but his hand moved slower now, more deliberate. Calla didn't push. She sat there in silence, just breathing near him, and picked up another pencil to sketch beside him. A few minutes passed like that, and it was then she noticed he had begun to mimic the rhythm of her strokes, long, gentle lines that mirrored her own. When Mrs. Alden returned 15 minutes later, her brows rose slightly at the sight. Wyatt was still silent, but he had turned the page of his sketchpad toward Calla, showing her his drawing: a tall figure with a coat, a small child holding their hand, and a girl with long hair standing just a little behind. "It's beautiful," she said, smiling at him. "Is that me?" He didn't nod, but he didn't deny it either. It was a start. The next few hours passed slowly. Calla was given a quick orientation of the house: what doors not to open, what floors to avoid, what questions never to ask. It was clear the mansion was full of rules that weren't written anywhere, but deeply understood by everyone who worked there. The third floor was off limits. Mr. Maddox's office was not to be entered without being summoned. Wyatt's room was sacred space, and Calla was to stay in her designated quarters unless otherwise instructed. Lunch was delivered to Wyatt's table by a maid who never spoke to either of them. Calla noticed Wyatt only picked at his food until she started eating too, and then he mimicked her movements. No words, just subtle gestures, mirrored actions. Later that afternoon, while Wyatt napped, Calla was summoned to the library. It was the only room in the house that felt warm. Deep mahogany shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, and a fire crackled softly in the hearth despite the mild weather outside. Thayer was seated in a leather armchair, a glass of something dark and expensive in one hand, his gaze distant. "Sit," he said without looking at her. She obeyed, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "You spent time with my son today," he said. "Yes," she answered. "He's quiet, but kind." Thayer looked at her then. Not a glance, not a casual look. He studied her. "You calmed him," he said, "more than any therapist or teacher we've tried." "I didn't do anything," she said honestly. "I just sat with him." "That's more than anyone else has done," he murmured. "He remembers his mother through silence. But today he gave you a drawing." Calla nodded slowly. Thayer rose to his feet and walked to the fireplace. "I need someone here who doesn't want anything from me. Not money, not leverage, not exposure." "I don't want anything," Calla said quietly. "I believe you," he replied. "And that terrifies me." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "You'll stay, indefinitely, if it continues to help him. You'll be compensated appropriately." She nodded, stunned by how easily he made life-altering decisions. "You'll also be watched," he added without apology. "Don't mistake kindness for trust." "I wouldn't dream of it," she said, her voice steady. He studied her one last time before dismissing her with a flick of his hand. As she walked back to her room that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that this house, this man, this child, wasn't just a temporary job. Something about the quiet pain in their lives, the way the walls seemed to hold their breath, the way Wyatt had looked at her drawing like he'd found something lost. It all felt like the beginning of something that couldn't be undone. Calla woke the UE next morning to a soft knock on her door. The light filtering through the heavy curtains was muted in silver gray. Another overcast day casting its hush over the Maddox estate. She sat up slowly, her limbs still aching slightly from the tension of the previous days. She hadn't yet adjusted to the silence that enveloped every corner of the mansion. Even the air here felt different, filtered, too clean, too still. She missed the messy noise of the city, the sound of buses groaning down cracked streets, the occasional argument breaking through thin apartment walls. But she also recognized something she hadn't felt in a long time: safety. For all its coldness, the mansion gave her something close to peace. It unsettled her more than she could explain. At the door stood a young maid, Alara, no more than a few years older than Calla herself, with a careful way of speaking and eyes that never quite met hers. She said Wyatt was awake and had already asked for Calla. The child's quiet insistence had apparently become something of a new routine. He hadn't spoken to anyone, not even in whispers, but his way of pointing toward the sunroom or toward Calla's hallway had become unmistakable. Wordlessly, Calla followed Alara down the wide stairs, her bare feet silent on the smooth oak steps. Wyatt sat curled in the window seat of the sunroom, his knees pulled to his chest and a blanket wrapped loosely around his frame. The sky outside was a flat sheet of gray, and faint mist clung to the windows, blurring the view of the gardens beyond. A tray with uneaten toast and sliced fruit sat untouched on the table. When Calla entered, his eyes lifted and then dropped again almost instantly, but he moved slightly to one side, making space for her beside him. She took the invitation as it was offered and sat. They didn't speak, of course. But silence with Wyatt wasn't uncomfortable. It was deliberate, like a shared language of breath and glances. Calla pulled her legs beneath her and glanced out the window with him, watching the rain begin to bead and race down the glass in narrow streams. She noticed his small hands were clutching a worn sketchpad again. He handed it to her with a little hesitation, not looking directly at her. She opened it and saw the latest drawing. It was of the same three figures she had seen before: the tall man, the child, and the girl with long hair. But this time, something was different. In the background of the drawing stood a large house, and behind it, small circles floated above the roof. Balloons. Balloons tied to a chimney, drifting into the clouds. The child had drawn smiles on all the figures. Calla's throat tightened. There was a tenderness to the image that felt fragile, like something precious that could vanish with one wrong move. She traced the outline of the long-haired figure with her thumb, and then looked at Wyatt. "It's us," she whispered, knowing he wouldn't answer. "You, me, and your dad?" He didn't respond, but he reached over and pointed to the balloons. Then, surprisingly, he held up three fingers. "3 balloons?" she asked gently. He nodded once. It was small, but it was something. The first movement of trust she'd seen from him that wasn't purely imitation or shadowed grief. She smiled at him, trying to hold back the emotion threatening to break free from her chest. That afternoon, Calla found herself alone in the garden behind the estate. It had started to drizzle again, but she didn't care. She wandered among the hedges and statues, touching the petals of roses that had somehow survived the cold. She needed to breathe, to think. Her thoughts kept circling Thayer Maddox, which she hadn't meant for them to do. He had appeared in her life like an avalanche, silent, massive, unignorable. There was something about the way he watched her, not in the way men on the street had stared at her before. His gaze wasn't lecherous. It was puzzled, like she was a riddle he hadn't planned to solve, but now couldn't stop trying to understand. She remembered how he had looked at Wyatt's drawing the night before, the flicker of something in his eyes. Pain, certainly, but also hope. He didn't show much emotion, and when he did, it was fleeting, buried under layers of control. But when it came to his son, his mask cracked, just slightly, just long enough for her to see that he wasn't cold by nature. He was cold by necessity, a man who had lost too much and didn't dare lose again. Later, as she returned to the house, she passed by one of the closed doors on the third floor, the floor they had told her not to enter. Something about it drew her attention, though she couldn't say why. The doorknob was brass and perfectly polished, untouched by dust. The hallway was silent. The air was heavier here, as though holding its breath. For a moment, she stood frozen, tempted to turn the handle. But then footsteps echoed behind her, and she stepped back quickly as Mrs. Alden appeared from the stairwell, giving her a pointed look. "I was just looking for the linen closet," Calla said, trying to sound casual. "There's nothing of use on this floor," the housekeeper replied, her tone firm but not unkind. "Let's keep your duties to the spaces where you're needed." Calla nodded and descended the stairs, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about that room mattered, that it wasn't just another guest suite, that it held answers, perhaps to the silence, perhaps to Thayer's pain, maybe even to Wyatt's. That evening, she sat with Wyatt again while he picked through his dinner. This time, he took 3 bites of pasta instead of 1. And when she told him a story, just something simple about a kitten she'd seen years ago chasing a pigeon in a parking lot, he didn't laugh, but his lips curved, almost imperceptibly. His eyes met hers for more than a second. In the hallway outside, Thayer watched from a distance, unnoticed. His hands were in his pockets, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left them. Calla had no idea he was there. She wouldn't have known that the sight of her gently coaxing life back into his son had made something shift in him, something long buried. That night, as she lay in bed, Calla stared at the ceiling and felt a growing certainty inside her. This place, this job, this strange, cold house full of grief, it was changing her. Or maybe she was changing it. Wyatt was healing. She was finding pieces of herself she thought had been lost in the noise of her former life. And Thayer Maddox, he was still a mystery, but even mysteries eventually unfold. She wasn't sure what was coming next. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. The morning air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves as Calla made her way through the back hallway of the estate. Autumn had fully settled over the grounds, wrapping the world in a blanket of fading gold and brittle red. She passed a window and paused for a moment, watching the wind scatter leaves across the marble path that led toward the lake. Something about the view made her chest ache. Not with sadness exactly, but with a feeling that reminded her of standing at the edge of something vast, something about to change. She shook the thought away and continued walking. Today had started like any other, but something in the air felt different. She found Wyatt already in the sunroom, waiting for her. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, building a castle out of wooden blocks, his sketch pad open beside him like a quiet companion. His hair was messy and he was wearing mismatched socks, one with rockets, the other with turtles. The sight made her smile. For all the silence and structure of this house, Wyatt was still a child, and slowly, piece by piece, she was learning how to reach him. She sat down beside him without a word and began building a second tower. After a moment, he handed her a block. No words, just a small offering of trust. As they built, she told him about the abandoned library she used to sneak into near her old neighborhood. It had broken windows and a leaking roof, but the books inside had always been dry, almost like they'd known how badly she needed them. She talked about the librarian who never asked questions, just let her read for hours as long as she put everything back exactly where it belonged. Wyatt didn't speak, but he listened. His hands paused their building now and then, as if he were letting the images sink in. When she looked over, she saw him smiling to himself. It was fleeting, but real. Later that day, Calla passed the grand staircase, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw Thayer descending it without his usual entourage of assistants or staff shadowing his movements. He wasn't on a call. He wasn't carrying documents. He was simply walking. Their eyes met, and she expected him to pass her with the same distant nod he usually gave. Instead, he stopped. "Walk with me," he said simply, as if it was something they had done a dozen times before. She hesitated for a moment, but nodded and followed. They stepped outside into the garden path without speaking. The wind tugged gently at the hem of her sweater, and she wrapped her arms around herself. Thayer didn't seem to notice the cold. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets, his gaze fixed ahead, his jaw clenched in that usual way that made him seem carved from stone. "I saw you with him this morning," he said after a long silence. "With Wyatt?" she asked softly. He nodded. "He gave you a drawing yesterday, one with the 3 balloons. Calla glanced at him. He didn't say what they meant, just held up 3 fingers. Thayer exhaled, a slow and deliberate breath. 3 was the number of weeks we were supposed to spend together in the countryside before Marla. He stopped himself, jaw tightening. Calla waited, sensing that whatever he was about to say came from somewhere deeper than conversation. She wanted to get away from all this, he continued, voice lower now. The board meetings, the interviews, the endless headlines. She hated the life that came with my name. But she loved me. Or at least she tried to. And she loved Wyatt. "I'm sorry," Calla said quietly. He shook his head. "I'm not telling you for pity. I just thought you should know. That drawing, that memory. He hasn't let anyone touch it. Until you." Calla looked ahead at the winding path through the garden, the trees bending slightly in the breeze. She felt his pain without needing to fully understand it. Grief wasn't something that ever really left. It simply changed shape, finding new corners of the heart to occupy. "Why did you hire me?" she asked before she could stop herself. Thayer stopped walking. He turned toward her, the cool light of the afternoon softening the edges of his face. "Because you didn't flinch," he said. "That night in the street, You looked me in the eye and handed me something I didn't realize I dropped. No fear, no expectation, just presence. I didn't know who you were. That's why it mattered." They stood there for a moment, the world around them still. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. "You remind me of her, not in appearance, not even in voice, but in the way you exist in silence." The words hit something inside her, and not just because they were unexpectedly kind. They frightened her, too, because she didn't want to be a replacement. She didn't want to be a mirror of someone gone. She wanted to matter on her own. "I'm not her," she said, a little more firmly than she intended. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm still talking to you." Back inside, the hours passed quickly. She read to Wyatt, fed him dinner, and coaxed a small laugh out of him with a silly impression of a talking dog. When she tucked him into bed that night, he reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. She kissed his forehead without thinking, and for the first time, he didn't pull away. She left his room and found herself drawn again to the third floor. She knew it was forbidden, but curiosity and instinct combined into something too powerful to ignore. Her footsteps were soft as she approached the same closed door. She reached out slowly and touched the brass handle. It was locked. She expected as much. But what surprised her was the faint smell of perfume in the air, delicate, floral, and strangely familiar. She didn't recognize it, and yet it made her throat tighten. Back in her room, she lay awake for hours, not because of fear, but because something inside her was stirring. Something about this house, this family, this broken pair of souls, father and son, felt tangled up with her own story in ways she didn't yet understand. She didn't know what would come next, but she was no longer simply surviving. For the first time in years, she felt like she was beginning to live. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Calla first arrived at the Maddox estate, and something unspoken had shifted in the air around her. The house, once silent and rigid, had started to soften at the edges. She noticed it in the little things. The way the staff no longer avoided eye contact with her, the way Wyatt began to wait for her by the sunroom door each morning instead of staying tucked in his corner, and the way Thayer lingered longer in the rooms where she happened to be, even if he didn't say much. None of these changes were spoken aloud, but they were felt, tangible, like the breath held in a room had finally been released. Calla had found a quiet rhythm in her days. Her mornings were spent with Wyatt, who now responded to her with small gestures and even quieter hums under his breath. He still didn't speak in full sentences, but he laughed sometimes, and that alone felt like a miracle. She would read to him from old books in the library, and he'd sit beside her, sometimes sketching, sometimes simply watching her mouth form words. Afternoons were filled with organizing, helping the housekeeper with small chores, and occasionally walking the garden paths alone when the silence indoors grew too heavy. Evenings were the strangest part of all. Thayer had started to ask her to join him for tea or a glass of wine in the library, under the guise of discussing Wyatt's progress. But the conversations rarely stayed on the child. More often, they veered into personal terrain, books she liked, memories from childhood, her thoughts on silence and what she feared most. She hadn't meant to share so much, but something in his stillness made it easy to speak. One late afternoon, as the light outside dimmed into a stormy dusk, Calla passed by the corridor on the third floor again. She had long since learned that the door at the end remained locked, yet today she felt something different radiating from it. She didn't understand it. There was no sound, no scent, but a strange electric pull in the air. Before she could talk herself out of it, she returned to her room and pulled out the drawer of her nightstand, where she had hidden the old skeleton key she had found tucked inside one of Wyatt's books weeks ago. She hadn't used it, hadn't even known if it belonged to anything, but something about the shape of it, the weight of it, had felt important. When she returned to the third floor, she glanced quickly over her shoulder before sliding the key into the door's lock. It turned with a soft, reluctant click. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room bathed in muted dust and shadow. No one had stepped foot in here for a long time. Inside was a preserved world, a time capsule of someone's life. It was a woman's room. That much was instantly clear. The vanity still held perfume bottles and hairpins, a half-used lipstick, a brush with strands of long auburn hair still tangled in the bristles. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets untouched, as though waiting for someone who was expected to return. A silk robe hung on the back of a velvet chair, and the scent in the air, soft lavender and something floral, matched the trace she had noticed weeks before. Calla stepped inside carefully, as though stepping into a sacred place. She ran her fingers over the dresser, brushing away a layer of dust. Beside the mirror was a framed photograph. It was Thayer and a woman, young, radiant, smiling in a way that made his whole face light up. Calla's breath caught when she saw it, not because the woman was beautiful, though she was, but because the resemblance was startling. The woman could have been Calla's older sister, the same high cheekbones, similar eyes, similar shape of the mouth. It was like staring at a version of herself that belonged to another lifetime. She sank down onto the edge of the bed, holding the photo. She had known this room belonged to Marla, Thayer's late wife, but she hadn't expected to feel this shaken. She felt intrusive, but more than that, she felt confused. Had Thayer seen the resemblance too? Was that why he had brought her into the house? That thought sat heavy in her chest. In the drawer of the vanity, she found a notebook. Marla's handwriting filled the pages in ink, both hurried and elegant. The entries weren't elaborate, just small observations, thoughts, things she wanted to remember. But toward the end, the entries darkened. There were mentions of feeling watched, of someone following her, of odd phone calls with no one on the line. Her last entry was only one sentence. If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. Calla closed the book slowly, her heart pounding. She rose and backed out of the room, locking the door again behind her. She returned the key to her nightstand and sat on her bed, trying to make sense of everything. Was Marla's death not what it seemed? Calla had never questioned the story. She had assumed it was a tragic accident, the kind that shattered families. But the journal suggested something different. And then there was the undeniable resemblance. If Thayer had noticed it too, why hadn't he said anything? Later that night, over a quiet dinner with Wyatt, Calla couldn't focus. She burned the soup. She forgot to offer him juice. The boy watched her with those silent, knowing eyes, as if sensing the chaos in her thoughts. When she finally tucked him into bed, he reached up and placed his small hand on her cheek. She almost broke in that moment. The gentleness of it, the comfort he offered her, when it should have been the other way around. She went down to the library afterward, needing answers, needing clarity. She found Thayer there, as she often did, seated in his chair by the fireplace with a drink in his hand. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression shifted. "You're pale," he said. "Are you all right?" She didn't answer right away. She sat across from him and stared into the fire. Her voice, when it came, was steady but low. "I went into her room." There was a pause, not of surprise, not of outrage, but of inevitability. "I know," he said finally. "I wondered how long it would take. You didn't lock it very well." "I didn't want to." "Why?" Thayer took a long sip of his drink. "Because maybe part of me wanted you to see it, to feel what I've been trying not to feel." "You mean her? Or yourself?" He didn't answer that. Instead, he looked directly at her, his eyes colder than she'd seen them in weeks. Not angry, guarded. "You look like her," he said, "but it's not your fault." "That's not comforting. It's not meant to be." Calla swallowed. "Did you bring me here because of her?" He shook his head. "I brought you here because of him. Wyatt. He responded to you. That was real. I didn't know how much else would follow." "And now?" "Now?" He stood slowly, setting his glass down on the table beside him. "Now I don't know if I can tell where she ends and you begin. And that terrifies me more than anything." He left the room before she could respond. Calla sat there long after he was gone, staring into the flames, the journal still heavy in her pocket. She wasn't sure who she was to this house anymore. A stranger? A substitute? A threat? But one thing she knew for certain, the truth hadn't died with Marla Maddox. It was still here, buried in silence, hiding in locked rooms, and haunting every step they took. And she intended to find it. The rain returned with a steady rhythm the next morning, tapping softly against the tall windows of the Maddox estate like a persistent whisper that wouldn't be ignored. Calla awoke early, though she'd barely slept. Her thoughts had kept her captive throughout the night, looping over and over the contents of Marla's journal, the eerie similarities between them, and the quiet confession Thayer had made in the firelit library. She had wandered the line between anger and sadness for hours, unsure of whether to feel like a victim or an intruder in a story that had started long before she arrived. The mirror in her room revealed dark shadows under her eyes and a tightness in her mouth she hadn't noticed before. She washed her face slowly, trying to clear away the exhaustion, but her reflection still felt like a stranger. She wasn't the same girl who'd arrived here weeks ago, soaked in city rain, clutching a duffel bag and a little hope. That version of herself had been simple. Surviving had been her only goal. But now the lines of her identity were blurred. She was still that girl, but also someone else entirely. Someone who had stepped into a life she never expected, who had earned the trust of a silent child and stirred feelings in a man who had buried his heart with his wife. Wyatt was waiting for her in the sunroom when she arrived, just as he always did. But this time he was already drawing. He didn't look up when she walked in, but she noticed the expression on his face. Focused, almost intent. She sat beside him quietly and glanced down at the paper. Her breath caught. He had drawn her, but not the version of her that lived in the house now. She was younger in the drawing, thinner, ragged at the edges. Her hair was loose, her eyes wide and unsure. He'd drawn her the way she had looked when they first met, and next to her, he had drawn himself smaller, hand tucked into hers. It was the first time he'd drawn himself holding anyone's hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "You remember everything, don't you?" He looked up at her then. His mouth opened like he might speak, but nothing came out. Still, the intention was there, written clearly on his face. She didn't press him. Instead, she pulled him gently into a hug, and he let her. That afternoon, Thayer didn't appear at any of his usual hours. He didn't stop by the sunroom. He wasn't in the study. Even Mrs. Alden seemed unsure of where he'd gone. It wasn't like him. His days were usually tightly controlled, every moment scheduled. His absence stirred something uneasy in Callah's chest, though she told herself not to worry. He was probably handling business. But it wasn't just the silence that concerned her. It was the weight of everything left unsaid between them. The truth of Marla's warnings in the journal still clung to Callah's mind like cobwebs. Marla had felt threatened before she died. She had believed someone was following her. And her death, conveniently labeled an accident, didn't line up with the fear written in her own handwriting. Callah hadn't spoken of it to anyone, not even Thayer. But the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the journal wasn't just a window into the past, it was a warning. That evening, as the rain thickened into a storm, the doorbell rang. Callah was in the hallway nearest the entrance and heard the chime clearly. Mrs. Alden answered it, and Callah caught a glimpse of the visitor through the glass. He was tall, well-dressed, with slick-back hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She had never seen him before, but something about him made her skin crawl. He introduced himself as Dean Archer, Thayer's lawyer and longtime friend. Callah stepped back into the shadows before he could see her. She waited, listening, her heart thudding in her chest. She heard low voices, Mrs. Alden directing him toward the study, and then silence again. For several minutes, she hovered in the hallway, torn between the urge to confront him and the instinct to stay out of the way. In the end, she slipped away and made her way toward the library, hoping Thayer had returned. To her relief, he was there. He stood by the windows, one hand resting on the glass, watching the rain. He didn't turn when she entered, but his voice greeted her softly. "You found the journal, didn't you?" She closed the door behind her. "I did." Still, he didn't face her. "Then you know Marla didn't die the way they said." Callah stepped closer, careful. "Did you?" His shoulders tensed, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered, "I suspected, but I couldn't prove it. I didn't want to believe it. The investigation was rushed. Her car was tampered with. The brakes failed, they said. An accident. Convenient. Clean. But Marla had enemies. People who didn't like what she was digging into." "Digging into?" Callah asked. "She was a journalist," he said, finally turning to face her. "Before she became my wife. She never stopped investigating the people behind the suits. Even after Wyatt was born, she had been looking into a private security firm, blackmail, political leverage, bribery. One night she told me she thought someone was watching the house. Then, the accident." "Why didn't you go public?" Callah asked, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. He gave a bitter smile. "Because I didn't want to lose Wyatt too, and because I was scared. For all my power, all my money, I couldn't protect her. I couldn't save her. And I knew if I pushed too hard, they'd come after what was left. Calla swallowed hard, the anger and sorrow rising in her throat all at once. Dean Archer is here, she said after a moment. He arrived an hour ago. That got his attention. His expression hardened, and he moved past her quickly. Stay with Wyatt, he ordered. Don't let him out of your sight. Calla followed him into the hall but stopped herself from chasing after him. Something in his tone had shifted, gone cold, urgent. She turned and ran up the stairs to Wyatt's room. The boy was asleep, curled up with his stuffed lion. She sat beside him on the floor, one hand resting on the edge of the bed, listening to the storm raging outside. She didn't know what Dean Archer had to do with any of this, but she knew something was coming, something that had been brewing beneath the surface of this house for too long. Secrets were shifting, shadows were moving. And if she had stepped into someone else's story, she was now a part of how it ended. She didn't feel like a maid anymore. She felt like a woman on the edge of something bigger than herself. And she wasn't running. Not this time. The night unraveled slowly, thick with tension and unsaid words. The rain outside hadn't let up. Instead, it had deepened into a steady, relentless downpour that drummed against the glass windows like a warning. Calla remained in Wyatt's room, watching over him as he slept, curled up in his blankets, the rise and fall of his small chest the only comfort in the storm. Her thoughts were spiraling, tangled in the weight of everything she now knew. Marla hadn't died in a simple accident. There had been whispers, warnings, and now a man in the house, Dean Archer, who had been too careful with his smile and too casual in his presence. She kept the door cracked just slightly in case she needed to hear footsteps approaching, though the hall beyond remained eerily silent. Every creak of wood, every shifting groan of the storm-swept mansion set her nerves on edge. The boy stirred once in his sleep and murmured something unintelligible, clinging to his lion. Calla smoothed his hair gently and whispered that he was safe. But was he? That question sat heavy on her chest, like a stone. Eventually she heard voices below. Low, harsh. Two men. She couldn't make out the words, but she could tell by the cadence that it was an argument. She stood, kissed Wyatt's forehead, and whispered that she would be right back. Then she slipped into the hallway barefoot, moving with practiced quiet toward the central staircase, avoiding the creaky boards she'd memorized during her weeks in the house. From the shadows of the second-floor landing, she saw them. Thayer and Dean stood in the drawing room, the doors half open, their voices just audible over the rain. Dean was no longer smiling. His face was hard, sharp, with something cruel underneath the surface. I told you to leave it alone, Dean was saying. You knew what she was getting herself into. You knew what she was risking. She was my wife, Thayer said. His voice was low but dangerous, each word deliberate. And she trusted you. I did what I had to do, Dean snapped. For the company. For your name. You think the board would have let her publish what she found? You think they'd let you keep custody of your son after that fallout? You would have lost everything. So you took her life instead. Thayer's voice broke slightly. Not from weakness, but from a fury so deep it twisted his control. Dean looked at him, jaw set. I didn't kill her, Thayer, but I didn't stop it either. Calla's breath caught. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears she was sure someone would hear it. She took a step back, nearly stumbling into a decorative table behind her. The sound was soft, but it echoed more than she'd expected. Both men turned sharply. Thayer's eyes met hers first, and she saw it. The flicker of realization, of fear for her, maybe of guilt. Dean followed his gaze and narrowed his eyes. Well, Dean said after a pause, it seems the girl has better ears than we thought. Calla didn't move. Her back straightened, and despite the pounding in her chest, she spoke. You let her die, she said to Dean. You stood by and let her die because it was convenient, because she made too much noise. Dean's expression didn't change, but there was something behind his eyes now. Recognition. Not of her presence in the house, but something deeper. You look like her, he said slowly. That's why you're here. Thayer stepped forward, placing himself subtly between them. She's not Marla, he said, and you're not going to speak to her again. Dean raised a brow. What are you going to do, Thayer? Expose me? Drag your family's name through the dirt for a dead woman and a maid who looks like her? I'd rather lose everything, Thayer said coldly, than stay silent one more day. Dean gave a short, bitter laugh and walked past them without another word. The front door slammed a minute later, followed by the distant sound of tires spinning through the gravel. The house fell silent again, but it was no longer peaceful. It was the silence after a fracture, dangerous and telling. Calla and Thayer stood there, alone in the dim hallway, rain still screaming against the glass. She felt dizzy, unsteady from what she'd heard. Her mind was racing, trying to reconcile the man who had sat in the library with her, who had helped his son build wooden castles, with the man who had carried this secret for years. "You knew," she said softly. "You suspected all along." Thayer's shoulders sank. He turned toward her, and for once he didn't hide behind silence or strength. "I wanted to believe it was grief," he said. "I wanted to believe she'd gotten careless, that it wasn't something darker. But I kept finding pieces. I didn't want to drag Wyatt through an investigation. I didn't want to bring more pain into a house already drowning in it." "But you brought me into it," Calla whispered. "You brought me here knowing I looked like her. You let your son bond with me. You let yourself—" She stopped herself before saying it. "I didn't bring you here to relive her," Thayer said. "I brought you because when I saw you, I felt something I hadn't felt since before she died. Not recognition, not replacement, just presence. Life. You reminded me that there's still something worth protecting." Calla stepped away, not out of anger, but because the storm inside her needed space. She wrapped her arms around herself. "Wyatt's the only innocent person in this house," she said, "and he's already lost more than a child should." "He won't lose you," Thayer said, his voice low, urgent. "Not if I can help it." She looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see the CEO. She saw the man who had failed and carried that failure like a wound. The man who hadn't killed his wife, but had let her ghost haunt every corner of his world. The man who had let grief harden him until it was too late to be soft. "I need time," she said quietly. "I need space to understand what I'm feeling." Thayer nodded. "Whatever you need, just don't leave without saying goodbye." She returned to Wyatt's room. He was still asleep, though his small face twitched now and then in restless dreams. She lay beside him on top of the blanket and watched the ceiling. Her thoughts drifted to Marla, to the journal, to the courage it had taken for a woman to write warnings no one had read in time. And she thought of herself, not as a maid, not as a replacement, but as a woman standing at the edge of something she had never asked for, but could no longer ignore. The house groaned with the storm outside, but Calla didn't feel fear anymore. She felt something heavier, deeper, and more necessary. Resolve. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a thin mist that clung to the estate like an exhale. The sky was pale and still, and the grounds around the Maddox mansion looked scrubbed clean by the rain. But inside the house, the air remained heavy with what had unraveled the night before. Calla stood by the window of her room, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched the fog roll slowly across the grass. Her reflection in the glass looked calm, but inside her thoughts were unraveling in slow, deliberate spirals. She had hardly slept, and when she had, her dreams were fragments. Marla's voice in a room that no longer existed. Dean Archer's cold expression, the echo of Thayer's broken voice as he confessed the truth in the dark. Wyatt had woken sometime before dawn, crawled into her bed wordlessly, and fallen asleep with his head on her shoulder. Now he was still curled beside her under the blanket, his breathing even and soft. She looked down at his small, trusting face and felt a tightness in her chest she couldn't name. She wasn't his mother, but he had given her a place in his world, a place she hadn't expected and hadn't asked for, but one she now couldn't bear to abandon. And yet part of her knew she might have to. Downstairs, the house was unusually quiet. Even the staff moved more carefully than usual, sensing the fracture that had occurred. Dean was gone, but his presence lingered like a stain on the floor, something undeniable, impossible to scrub away. Thayer hadn't appeared that morning. No one had seen him. Mrs. Alden told Calla in a tight, formal voice that he was handling business matters and that she shouldn't worry. But Calla did worry, because now that she knew the truth, nothing could go back to the way it had been. Around mid-morning, Thayer sent for her. She found him in the greenhouse, where the last of the summer's greenery clung to life in pots and hanging planters. The space was warm with natural light, and the scent of soil and leaves was a strange contrast to the tension between them. He stood with his back to her, trimming a vine that had grown too wild. When she stepped in, he spoke without turning. I'm selling the house. The words hit her harder than she expected. Her voice came slower than usual. Why? I need to start over. For Wyatt, for myself. Too many ghosts here. Too many lies stitched into the walls. She stepped forward but didn't speak. He continued trimming, his movements sharp and clean. I filed the official report this morning, he said, against Dean. I have copies of Marla's journal, recordings of conversations I had with him in the months after her death. Notes she'd hidden that I didn't recognize for what they were. It's not conclusive, but it's enough to open an investigation. The rest will follow. She watched him work and only then realized how exhausted he looked. The perfect posture and pressed suits were still in place, but the tension that had once made him seem untouchable now just made him seem tired, human, haunted. Why now, she asked. He set down the clippers and finally turned to face her. Because you made me remember what it feels like to be afraid of losing someone before it's too late to hold on to them. She lowered her eyes, unsure what to say. I didn't bring you here to fall in love with you, he said. That wasn't part of the plan. You reminded Wyatt how to smile. You reminded me how to feel. But I don't want to confuse gratitude with love. You deserve to choose whether you stay. And I won't try to stop you if you go. Calla swallowed the lump in her throat. She had waited to hear him say those words. Maybe not in those exact terms, but with that raw honesty. Now that he had, she didn't know how to respond. I don't want to be a substitute for someone you lost, she said. I don't want to live in a house full of memories I didn't make. You're not, he replied softly. You're the first memory I want to make that doesn't hurt. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. She looked past him, to the vines tangled in the corner of the greenhouse, reaching toward the light. I'm leaving, she said finally, and the words felt like a blade even though they came from truth. Not forever, but I need time, away from this place, away from what I might become if I don't step out of the shadow I've been cast into. He didn't protest. He didn't beg. He just nodded. I'll make sure Wyatt knows it's not because of him, he said quietly. She managed a smile. He's stronger than both of us. He smiled too, faintly, painfully. I know. That afternoon she packed what little she had. Wyatt came to her room as she zipped her bag and stood quietly in the doorway. She crouched down and opened her arms. He ran into them and buried his face in her shoulder. They stayed like that for a long time. When he finally pulled back, he handed her one of his drawings. Her, him, and Thayer, standing on a pier, holding hands. Above them, the sky was bright blue. You can come visit me, she whispered, anytime. And when you're ready, you can call, and I'll answer. He nodded solemnly and pressed the picture into her hands. Mrs. Alden drove her to the station. As the car pulled away, Calla didn't look back at the mansion. Not because it didn't matter, but because she needed to focus on what came next. She had spent her whole life surviving, shaping herself to fit into the spaces she was allowed. Now she was stepping into the world with purpose. Not as a maid, not as a reflection of someone else, but as herself. 2 months later, she received a letter from Thayer. It was short, handwritten in his neat, restrained script. The house has been sold. Wyatt started school. He spoke his first full sentence to a teacher. He said, I want to go home now. They asked him where home was, and he said your name. You were never a shadow of her, Calla. You were the light that broke through when we thought the world had closed. If you ever come back, there will be no mansion, no ghosts, only us. She read it 3 times and folded it carefully. That night, for the first time in years, she dreamed of a future. One where she could build something of her own, not inherited from tragedy, but born from choice, from love, from healing. And when she woke, the sun was rising. She took it as a sign.